Okay, right, so, rule of law is it sounds like a really posh phrase. It's not. You, as a person, have an expectation of the law. So the law is it's the baseline of citizenship. We can all look at the law, we can look at any legislation we like, and it's a published statement, it's a settlement of political needs at the time. Like, most equality legislation, I'm not going to talk about equality legislation in this video, but the evolution of equality legislation is really, really interesting, because each time it's a settlement against a political crisis, and it's about market making, and it's about, you know, appeasing everybody, and then creating a baseline of the rule of law, and then creating a framework through which future questions can be resolved so that people can access our justice system. Now, our institutions in this country are held under the Crown, not under Westminster. We have, all our institutions are held under the Crown. The civil service, our justice system, they're all kept separate under the Crown, and they're evolved as part of this one big fuck-off structure. And the first rule of law I want to talk to you about is civil service institutions. Now, I am a born civil servant, like, genuinely. I have no ability to be politically tribal. I have no ability to do tribalism at all. And I started in the civil service at the Contributions Agency as an inspector support officer when I was like, that was really my first proper job. I had a desk. I was really excited. I had a desk and a phone. I felt really important, but I wasn't very important. I was on $7,500 a year. But it was a really good job. The civil service were good to me. But your job as a civil servant is to deliver policy within the rule of law, fairly and impartially. And if you have a Google of the Civil Service Code of Conduct, the civil service, every civil servant is required to follow that. And when Dr. Haddock went searching for me on the internet and found my train thing, one of the things that really, really fucked up my civil service career was getting on the front page of the Daily Mail, because that will fuck up your civil service career. Because you're not allowed to comment on a political issue. And the reason that you're not allowed to comment on a political issue is because you're the person who delivers policy, and every policy has unintended consequences. Every single policy, because a tiny policy come up with in fucking Westminster, once it's delivered to a country of 64 million people through a network of institutions, you know, the civil service are like a filter, basically, and the policymakers that we have in this country have never had to think about what they do. They have never had to think about why it is we have these institutions that act impartially. We have never had they don't ever have to think about things like equality legislation and whether this policy that they're implementing here will break the law. Because by the time it has filtered and dripped through these institutions and the number of people whose job it is to completely keep an eye on that, they don't have to, and they've never had to before. But the problem that we have is for about 30 years we've had a belief system where we've been hollowing out our institutions because we've decided that things that economists can't see are inefficient, and actually that's the things that keep the country stable. So for the first time in a very, very long time, we're going to have to consider the rule of law as upheld by our civil service institutions. Now, it isn't just Austerity that's done that, like, although the Home Office is in a really bad way. The DWP is not upholding the rule of law, and in fact is a fucking basket case. And we've got a whole bunch of problems. But Brexit is now the framework through which we will actually address these institutional problems. And in actual fact, Brexit is going to force us to re-examine which institutions keep us stable and re-examine our core institutions and look at things like the civil service. And then through the civil service, you have the expectation that whatever other law that there is, whatever safeguarding frameworks, whatever equality legislation, whatever new vulnerable groups are identified, that the civil service and their impartiality and commitment to the rule of law will make sure that policy is filtered through, and that will happen. This is not currently happening. Now, the consequence of this is that we have some institutions like the Home Office and the DWP that are basically, like, the DWP's on its knees. It's been eroded over a very long time. It's been hollowed out by nudging to call centres and now nudging to digital, and the staff are no longer trained the way we were. Like, you know, we have institutions that are deeply unstable. But it's important to know that one of the reasons that we don't have any policymakers who know what to do with that is that we haven't had to have policymakers who even were aware of these institutions for a very long time. And the reason for that is they're so fucking reliable. And the other important thing is to know that even though they're not like these aspects of our institutional structure are eroded and we have problems at the minute, they're still functioning. So there's a huge amount of institutional resilience there. So the first aspect of the rule of law that I wanted to talk to you about is the invisible rule of law that none of us consider, what civil servants do. And they operate to very, very strict rules about expressing political opinions, about, everything, and that's where this starts. Within civil service institutions, reflection on identity starts there, because civil servants are expected to reflect on their own beliefs and make sure that their delivery of policy is impartial and within the rule of law that exists. So that's the first building block for the rule of law. Now, not only is this a building block that our current policymakers have never considered because they've never had to, but this is actually because these systems have been so reliable. So during Brexit, we are going to be forced to examine the role of the civil service. We are going to have to be forced to examine the role of different institutions and the way that the rule of law is being upheld in these institutions, and we are actually going to be forced to address that. With the DWP, we're going to have to address why it is that we've got an institution that's just rode roughshod over other illegal frameworks, and the roots of that are in welfare economics, which I've already talked on in Crisis of Immediate and Class P playlist, but I'll talk about again in this playlist because I think it's important. So it's important to understand that these are the building blocks of the rule of law. This is the first baseline. This is, the civil service. This is the things that are invisible that we do not consider because they're so reliable. And they're not fucking reliable at the minute. So that's, the first building block. What we're going to do in the next one, we're going to start looking specifically at local authorities, and then we're going to divide it down between adults and children, because there's some really important stuff about power dynamics and where we intervene and where we don't. And we're also going to look at social care specifically and capacity legislation, because that's something that's going to come into your view too. So that's the second video in the Rule of Law playlist.